Blockchain Show is a podcast that demystifies cryptocurrencies and distributed ledger technology.
Got the co-hosts from Your Bytes Your Rights, guys. It's a real honor to have you, Chris Kameir and Jeff Jockisch. Welcome, guys.
Thanks, Ethan.
You guys are definitely one that I tune in on Fridays. Like clockwork, you guys are always pumping them out. And I think, what are you up to, like 20 episodes now?
We just did our 20th or 21st. I think we're doing the 21st on Friday, so tomorrow.
Yeah. And I know we're kind of focusing on the podcast today, but if you guys want to say anything about your backgrounds, Jeff, I'm sure we want to learn a little bit about what you're doing too. Maybe we start with you, Jeff, if you don't mind.
Well, sure. I'm a data privacy researcher and the CEO of a privacy consulting company called Privacy Plan. But I primarily focus on privacy advocacy and creating data sets in the privacy world. So, for instance, collaborative privacy sets on privacy laws and privacy regulators and privacy enhancing tech companies, and virtually, building data sets around anything that relates to data privacy and trying to share those with the world.
Awesome. And Chris?
The obvious one is the funny accent originated in Germany. I was a software developer for a very brief period of time in the 80s, early 90s. Then first went to school to get a degree in linguistics and classical literature. Realized that's going to make me a teacher, which I'm definitely not well suited to long term. So I went to law school. After law school, joined one of the first internet service providers as their general counsel. We got very lucky to sell that company at the height of the .com. In early 2000, retired from the law, moved into venture, and moved to Southern California and started to focus on investing in peer-to-peer solutions. And then fast forward, that's what we focus on still today, and focusing on what I call building the web, the World Wide Web for the first time. My contention for a long time has been that we never built the World Wide Web, we built the commercial web. I'm trying to fix that. And whenever I find people that are as enthusiastic about topics and subsets of these topics, then I'll try to add them to my ever-growing tribe. So that's how Jeff and I met. I think we were originally speaking on at the same event, and quickly realized we're both in this for very, I wouldn't say altruistic reasons, but passionate about getting the topic right. And so a lot of times you'll just meet people that are just promoting a certain company, a certain idea. And I think both of us have a much bigger philosophy and much longer outlook, which is important.
Yeah, definitely. That's something when you're talking about building the web for the first time, I kind of felt foolish because the last guest, we're talking on and on about transition from Web 2 to Web 2 to Web 3, and I read something you wrote online about how we're not even in Web 1. Could you expand on that a little bit, because that kind of
Sure. Yeah. I mean, the term Web3 has been used for 20 years on and off. Actually, the peak was in 2004 when we first applied those labels. And it's just one of those marketing terms, just like fintech. It's just a marketing term. But as a technologist, you take the versioning pretty serious, right? So what makes up the web? And as far as I'm concerned, the web is a network of loosely connected computers where you share information out of your own motivation and with other parties, peer-to-peer mostly, to simplify this massively, right? So that was the initial implementation. And then it kind of devolved in the scenario where you're basically never doing that. What you're actually doing is, to make the most obvious example, when you Google something, you're not on the World Wide Web, right? You're engaging with one for-profit company. You're putting into a query into what's called a search box. It's not really a search box. So you're querying the databases of Alphabet Inc., and they are specifically its subsidiary Google. to get a certain result back, and that result is optimized for the objectives of that particular holding company, which is to say it's increasing shareholder value. So everything that you're seeing is based on this overriding algorithm. And so that's why when you say what's bad about like calling things Web 1, Web 2.3, it makes it sound like it's this kind of linear development, but it's not linear. If you started out calling something Web 1, it's really a paradigm shift. And what I mean by that specifically, and I don't want to make this a monologue, so I'll keep it short, but right now, essentially what I was describing to you is kind of this push paradigm. You're engaging with one entity and it's pushing some information usually onto you. And that's problematic, right? Because that entity has its own agenda that might override your agenda. So to simplify this massively, what we want is a pull paradigm, to where the information that you're being presented is being pulled in by your own filter. By the things that you installed, by the algorithms that you want to see work on yourself. And to yet again put another like a label on that, right now what I think we have is social engineering as a service for bad or for any purpose. What I want to see in the world is social engineering for good, where I want to be able to set my agenda and say, if I engage with this particular technology, i.e. the web and with information distributed on the web, afterwards, I want to feel better about myself. I want to be smarter. I want to be healthier. I want to be whatever, rather than I'm just an Oracle function providing data, quote unquote, to a third party objective. And as you know, Ethan, you always have to interrupt me because there's a lot of pent up energy still. Since it's really, to me, and the reason being is because that's a realization that I had 14 years ago, right? With a lot of clarity at that point in time, to the extent that I wrote this down and wrote an article that said, you're not a Google user, you're a Google product. Now this is almost common sense, thankfully, but it took 14 years for that to create a little more awareness than what I want to see, where everybody realizes that. And I was just talking about this on our previous call, to where like your systems should actually actively and violently alert you to instances where your human agency is interfered with, right? So if my phone is right now communicating my location information and I don't need that information, like I'm sitting here at my desk, I'll be sitting here at my desk for some time, then it should actually violently make noises and flash a light saying, hey, your location information is being transferred right now, and these are the entities that are consuming this information. Alert, 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 alert. Anyway, so typical long answer to your question why I don't think that it's helpful to try to slap marketing labels like Web3 on technologies that are fundamentally actually different and a paradigm shift from what we have right now. It's not a linear development.
Yeah, that's very interesting, eye-opening. It's really helpful listening in when you guys talk, because you can kind of sort out the lingo. You know, that I feel like you said, a lot of these terms kind of get thrown around. And I was worried years ago when naming this show the blockchain show, that in like 10 years it'd be like having something called the internet show. Like, you know, no one's going to care. It's going to be, I mean, I don't know, maybe, but we're still kind of seeing the effects. And it's like, Jeff, I'm curious of what your take on this is, because I know that, you know, privacy is a huge theme of the podcast. You know, do you see blockchain as being, you know, a solution or the solution, like a lot of people want to make it out to be, or is it just going to be kind of a conglomeration of different things to get to a more private internet?
I think, Ethan, that blockchain or distributed ledger tech is probably one of the main ways that we get to privacy enhancing tech that can be a big solution. I'm not sure I visualize exactly how that's going to happen, but I think it's a big part of the solution. I think Chris has it right. The problem we have right now is that we don't really have the user agency and the ability to control our identity. And those are sort of the key ways that we can leverage our privacy or control that privacy element. And without that, we're sort of stuck in that non-player character role. Back in the same time frame when Chris was having his revelations, I was working for a search engine, actually a text-based search engine called Cha-Cha. This was sort of before Google ate the world, and there were still actually people, mostly teenagers, who didn't have access to a smartphone. And they were texting us questions, actually like 4 billion questions, I think, before we ended up, closing the doors on that business. So we had to sort of develop, a whole, knowledge graph and, process all those questions. And it was really interesting to do that. And in the process of doing that, I started thinking a whole lot about digital identity and how do we actually control that digital identity. And it's an interesting proposition. And I came to sort of the same conclusions that Chris did, right? That we can pretend to be different people on different websites, but we really don't have any control over what those people are allowing us to do or the information that they're collecting about us. And the reason I got so involved in privacy later on is because I was seeing data brokers collecting information and selling that information about us, right? For instance, like lists of rape victims and auto accident crash victims and, gamblers and, any kind of crazy information you could think of that was just available for sale online for pennies. And that was sort of a klaxon call for me to start to sort of move into data privacy.
Yeah. I'm glad you guys are doing the podcast because it's really, even though I've had a lot of these things in the back of my mind, tuning in every week really brings it to the forefront. And I'm always amazed the topics you guys are bringing up and the guests each week. Hopefully we can get more people tuning in every week. I know that there's a lot of podcasts nowadays to choose from, but and then kind of breaking through is a trick. I mean, it took us it took us like 6 years to hit 1 million downloads. So hopefully you guys do that in like next month, I'm not saying we're that big right now, but how would you like to see the conversation shift towards in the mainstream and in people's, basically like how do we get people to care? Because it seems like a lot of people either they don't know or they do know and they don't care. How do we get there?
Yeah, let me zoom out for just like 60 seconds here. So the success of our species, of the human species, by and large is based on the fact that we learned to collaborate. So collaboration is the reason that you see everything around you right now. If you had to create that microphone by yourself and without any other people doing anything before you would spend your entire life just doing that. Right? Yeah. And everything around you came about through the process of cooperation. So the primary technology we use for collaboration and cooperation, I just sent Jeff an article on like the difference between those two topics, and the primary technology for collaboration and cooperation is language. So you need to have the language to tell someone, well, I need a condenser, and then like the exercise we went through, like at the beginning, if I don't have the language to adjust my microphone, I don't know what to look for, then any type of cooperation is going to be very hard if you speak a different language specifically, right? So it comes down to just the high level stuff. If I speak German and you don't understand German, then communication is going to be hard. And also if we're talking about a different subset, audio engineering, then your vocabulary is going to be much wider than mine, and it's going to be difficult for me to have an intelligent conversation about that topic without first learning that language. So then we developed a lot of technologies in addition to language to distribute language. So the main technology we're kind of using right now, right? So we're using voice over IP to distribute language. It hits your ear, and then if we're doing asynchronous collaboration, then we're using email, or we're trying to retrieve quote unquote information from networks. And so that's where the big problem, in my opinion, starts, because now we introduced a third-party interest into this collaboration and into that tool of language and distribution of language that makes collaboration and cooperation much harder. And not only much harder, but also there's a different interest that's overriding the interest of the people that are communicating, to the extent that it's in the interest of certain entities involved in this exchange to actually pitch the people that are trying to communicate against each other. And people are unaware of that. So now there's a little more awareness of that, but it seems like there was this kind of short up flare after like the social dilemma, and then people went back to doing what they were doing, right? So big picture here is realize what makes our species successful, what technologies are we using, and then there specifically, as you know, I'm very involved in like fixing our language of value specifically, which is totally bastardized by third-party interest, but intermittently also fixing the distribution of information that we're using right now. And again, we need to simply learn the language of the space. So Jeff touched on a few terms earlier, and you did too, that are all not very well understood, right? So blockchain is not the same, right? It's just like internet technology and the internet are not the same. DLTs are not blockchains. And in terms of like talking about individuals and personas, we internally developed a more nuanced language to even be able to talk about that. So I referred to like what you can control online as your persona. So let's call it the data that you control online is your persona. And then there's a profile, and that's the data that you control plus the data that the entity that you're engaging with, so Google, Facebook, has about you and attaches to your persona for the purpose of profiling you, for the purpose of targeting you to change your behavior on the behest of the highest bidder, right? So having the language tools is kind of the first step to be able to address these problems, right? Just like when we fixed the microphone earlier, it's like, okay, you pointed out that there's those different gains and whatnot. So that let us fix this particular problem. Unless you have the language, you cannot fix the problem. So to shortcut this to the objective of our Your Bytes Your Rights call is to bridge language tools first and foremost between different disciplines. So between the disciplines of cybersecurity, privacy research, laws and regulations. So we have people from different backgrounds on purpose on these calls so that they can actually have a meaningful conversation, because on a daily basis, that's what we see. We see people trying to talk to each other. They're using the same vocabulary, the same terms, the same language, but they're not having a conversation because they're using it differently. Last thing that stood out to me, and then I stopped my usual tirades here. I went to a conference a couple of years ago where I spoke, and the entire conference was 4 years with 4 days and 4 tracks. So hundreds and actually thousands of people were all talking about the same topic, quote unquote, which is a word that Jeff mentioned earlier, digital identity and identity management. Literally, every single one was using the term differently, and literally, actually, no one talked about it, that actual term digital identity. Right? So no one was having a conversation. So they were either talking about access management or data brokerage. So they didn't have the nuance in language and that's an unfortunate legacy of our indoctrination system that we still call education, but we don't really have education, is you're indoctrinated into a certain discipline, you adopt the vocabulary and taxonomy of that particular discipline, and that leads to kind of almost groupthink. Right. So there's kind of this one-dimensional linear thinking, because now the term identity is this one thing in your vocabulary.
You're right. It's important. I definitely need to be more careful about my word choice because, like you said, we have to be able to talk about it. And I really do think that your guys' podcast is one of the most important conversations happening like on the planet. Like, I mean that. I think it is really important when I think about my kids' future. And if there's any small chance that we can influence that towards where they might have a better life, it's definitely in this area is a big part of it. I mean, sure, there's other problems that we face as a species, but it's getting creepy, man. Just even trying to buy a TV, I couldn't find one that didn't have some built-in microphone that was either Android or Google or some other operating system that was going to listen in. And even the ones with the switch to turn off the microphone, it's like, I don't know if that actually works. Like, the only thing for sure that works is if I unplug it from the wall. Mm-hmm. I even went as far to look at, big computer monitors that didn't have this, the quote unquote smart functionality, but it's not just TVs, it's our phones. We're bugging ourselves. We're walking around with them in our pockets. People have earbuds in that are connected. They've got HomePods and Alexa.
And it wouldn't be so bad if we get to have the choice to set the objectives of these tools, right? But we are not given that objective, that option to set our own objective, right? Typically, when you buy a tool, you get to set the objective, right? So the simple example I used to make for that so that people understand the difference is if you're buying a hammer, right? The hammer has one function. The hammer centralizes centrifugal force. So then your use case will typically be I put a nail in the wall. And then another use case could be harming another person. That's not obviously a function of the hammer. That's a particular use case. So the point of this distinction is a lot of times this distinction is not made. We should insist on the fact that this is the function. This is how I want to use it. I want to use it then, this particular tool, let's call it the internet, let's call it the World Wide Web. I want to use it to be happier, healthier, smarter. Let me set those dials. Let me set those algorithms. And there's a few proposals right now. And there's like the first settlement has been done pretty recently where under a court order, a company was actually required to delete an algorithm. That's a good start, right? To realize it's not enough to quote unquote delete the data, right? So like forgetting data is kind of a quaint request from a technologist perspective, but to be able to delete algorithms and then ultimately be able to set your own algorithms. That's what I want. That's what I wanted for the past 14 years, right? Give me that dial. What's the objective for you to use this tool? Oh, I want to get smarter. I want to get healthier. I want to get happier. To me, that should be rather common sense, right? And honestly, I want the same thing for like entertainment things that I engage with. It's like when I get a selection presented by Netflix, Amazon, whatever, then I want to have the option to say how will this movie most likely make me feel after I'm done watching it? Will it make me happy, angry, sad? I want to like base my decision on that, like action, romantic comedy, blah blah blah. That only can tell me so much. I want to know how I feel afterwards, or if there's something to be learned. It's like, am I likely going to be smarter afterwards, for example, right? What's the outcome, right? Well, as far as I'm concerned, we're using tools towards specific outcomes, and you want to measure these outcomes and you want to control these outcomes, and you definitely don't want to defer to a third party for these outcomes, right? Yeah. But I don't know why this is like, to me, is like almost like telling people the sky is blue. Like, why is that not something that we discussed before we created this, or while we created that, right? Like you were referring to your kids, and I was just watching The Social Dilemma again over the weekend, and everybody should watch it like once a quarter, I guess. But yeah, all these executives from Facebook, from Google, from Twitter, they were referring to their own kids and saying, yeah, I'm not going to let them engage with Facebook until they're at least in high school. Right?
Yeah.
That's people who built these technologies. They came to that realization, but then for some strange reason, we allow these entities, these for-profit corporations, to keep doing this at scale to young people and old people. It really doesn't matter, but young people is obviously specifically problematic because I grew up reading a book every single day, an entire book every single day for more than a decade, right? I don't know, my hunch would be that if you try to get a teenager to read an entire book, not let alone in a day, but in a week, you would have a tough time getting that task accomplished because there's a reasonable chance that this child has been conditioned to consume information in 15 or 30-second bite-size chunks, right? Rather than being able to focus on a text-based only medium for long periods of time. And I'm not generally saying that one is better than the other, but I think if you want to make a meaningful impact on human well-being, it will by and large require a good portion of the human society to focus for long stretches at a time, right? You're not gonna create a cure for cancer in 15 to 30-second bite-sized chunks, right? You need to be able to focus for a very long time. Anyway, as I said, we should probably have like a little timer whenever I start talking that prompts me to stop talking after 90 seconds.
Oh, it's okay. Jeff, I know you got to get going soon, but do you got time for one more question?
Sure.
I know earlier we were talking about it's going to take, probably multiple approaches to reach more privacy. And the thought popped up about governmental regulation when Chris was talking about that algorithm that got shut down. Do you think that, first of all, I don't know if our public officials know enough to make any worthwhile change. Is it only going to come from a technological point, or is it going to have to be government regulation? And then how do you get people involved? It just seems like there's like multiple pieces to the puzzle, and I'm just kind of curious what your take is on the U.S. government getting involved.
I think things are actually changing. I'm pretty optimistic. There's a current bill that has a chance of passing in the federal government, sort of labeled the Three Corners Bill, or ADPPA. It may not pass, but I think there's more and more pressure. Consumers are actually getting more aware, and frankly, they've been aware for a while, but I think industry is sort of made a case in the past that consumers were somehow making a rational choice to sort of give away their privacy, and that really hasn't been true for quite a while. There was this sort of theory that consumers were making this rational choice, that they were privacy pragmatists, and that's never really been true. What's really going on is, and there's a couple of new studies out right now, one from Incogni, which is like a privacy agent that helps you sort of opt out of data brokers and other sources, and another one from Catch, which is a privacy information company. And the Catch study actually says that 82% of people they surveyed, it was over like 2,500 people, 82% of people were very concerned about the data that was gathered and used about them. And I think they also had said that this was really interesting, right? That data privacy was the top priority for 74% of the people that they surveyed, even more important than other ethical things like sustainability and diversity and inclusion, right? So of the things they asked them about, data privacy was the top concern for 74% of people that they surveyed. And that's like political pressure that politicians have to start listening to. So I do think things are changing. They're changing in the rest of the world, and I think they're going to have to change in the United States too. And aside from political pressure, right, companies have to actually start listening to that kind of consumer pressure. The reason that the things haven't changed up to this point is that we have such a market where there are no alternatives for people, right? So you can say that the consumers are making a choice to use Facebook, but there's no alternative to Facebook. Where else are they going to go to be able to connect with all of their social graph? There isn't one, right? Where else are they going to go other than Twitter, right, to potentially have that sort of public square? Okay, there are some alternatives, right, but there are really no good alternatives to that, right? Where are they going to go to connect with people sort of in their workspace? There's LinkedIn. Is there really an alternative to LinkedIn? Not particularly, right? So there aren't really great alternatives to the services that we're using in the world today. And that's why people are making this choice, because there are no alternatives for them to choose.
That's really well said. I think more hopeful. I tend to get a little too like doom and gloom on this podcast. So thanks for giving me a dose of reality. It's funny, earlier when we were talking about Facebook, I remember in high school I had a cashier job, and an older lady was talking to the next person over and saying that her daughter had just got a job in San Francisco working at Facebook. And then she said, "It's not going to last though." And she started laughing. And I was just like, I don't know. I think they're onto something. This is like in 2007. But I would, even back then, I had no idea it would become such a huge thing. And it seems like a uniquely American issue for some of these corporations just to get so massive to the point where it's difficult to affect change. But, I am hopeful, like you said, that the people are starting to wake up to that, or have been, maybe at least now want to do something about it. So
I think the request that Frances Haugen, so the Facebook whistleblower, made was exactly right. Like, everybody should be given access to the data that Facebook has, and obviously in an anonymized fashion, to do an analysis on how it affects people, right? So we anecdotally kind of know that like teenage self-mutilation and whatnot increased dramatically after Instagram and the iPhone launched. It like tripled, and can be more or less directly be attributed to the emergence of these solutions. But then overall, I think it's very important that we measure these externalities, right? So I look at this in the same way that I look at any other things in industry, like car emissions or whatever it is. We should measure the externalities of these technologies, and there should be a mandate for that, because needless to say, these companies already measure a lot of things with granularity if it serves themselves, right? So they measure, are people longer engaged, more engaged, is this higher conversion and so forth. So they definitely have the capacity, the ability to also measure these externalities, and they should be obliged to do so. And then we have the data to react to that. If we figure out that it has these particular health and mental health externalities to society, then we can and should react accordingly. And I'm always the last person to suggest regulation. I think that's a bad idea. I think we should just create attribution, though. As in, my typical go-to example for that is, I assume that there is one person, let's call it one child right now, doing something entirely stupid, like drinking bleach to cure him or herself from COVID. And we should be able to analyze, like, why did this particular individual come to this decision? And my suspicion there is that, based on amplification that these tools provide you with, this person came to the conclusion that drinking bleach is a good idea to solve your COVID problem. And so then, if we can attribute this result, this real world health result, to this technology and the person providing this technology in a particular fashion, then we need to hold them responsible. So my suggestion is always, let's just create this agency attribution layer so that we can identify these externalities and then present them to people and saying, you are partially or entirely responsible for this outcome. And then we don't actually most of the time find out that we don't need additional regulation. What we need is just create this agency attribution layer to hold whatever, to make just a random example, Facebook responsible for the murder or self-mutilation of this individual because they helped create this particular echo chamber of information around them, and they knew that they did. Right? That should be enough to then get a conviction and then put some of the executives either in prison or fine them so heavily that they change their monetization behavior. And then as a general rule of thumb, I think all of these large network technologies should always provide an option that says, okay, we are making like, show me this is how much you make from influencing my behavior every year. And I think that's actually already the case if you look at their earnings reports, that they say, okay, a user is worth, I believe, is like $37 a year. Correct me, it doesn't really matter, to be honest. But let's say I'm worth $37 a year to a particular social platform. Well, then give me that option to just pay you that directly instead. And then all the quote unquote data that you have about me, let me store that on my end and give me my own private data silo, and I get the granularity that I want with that, right? But that should always be an option in my mind, right? So like advertising as a business model to me is very suspect. That this should even be a thing, specifically for such an important tool, which I would call specifically, like if we were referring to the World Wide Web as a commons, as something that we should have all equal access to. But we don't. We really don't, right? We have a very particular filter that other entities set for us to get, quote unquote, access to that, right? It's kind of like the equivalent of your car deciding where you're going to go once you get into your car. I'm just going to take you here, right? Or the other metaphor I think people should embrace for that is if you're going into a mall, so there's a destination mall pretty close to where my office is. So if you go into a mall and you walk through the mall and you buy some ice cream and otherwise do window shopping, well, imagine if based on that, all the shops that were in this mall would now have a complete record of your social security number, your first and last name, your home address, your likes, your dislikes, and would track you from then on out. Like you would think that's kind of an absurd suggestion, but yet that's exactly what's happening if you engage with most of these large network sites. Right? That's exactly what's happening. To me, again, one thing is not more absurd than the other one. It's the same level of absurdity to me. Always has been.
Yeah, I mean, that would be great to have the option just to pay, so you don't get your privacy, or I mean your data collected, but you know, I don't know if I would have trust that they would honor that, you know, and how would you be able to prove that they're not just taking your money, and then also like through the back door selling it anyways. And maybe I have like a childlike trust in blockchain technology, but it's like, is there some sort of solution where you can verify that? Yeah, okay.
Yeah, I mean, that's what we're talking about on a daily basis and also on the show, right? So now specifically that we're introducing new solutions like mapped cryptographic primitives and decentralized software solutions, blockchain being kind of the most obvious one right now that everybody talks about. But yet again, it's kind of a useless marketing term, unfortunately, already. But ultimately, the principle, if you want to understand this from a very high level, is that right now what we're using by and large is client-server technology, which means you're interacting with a database. And this database is maintained by a third party who has control over what's getting recorded, what's getting deleted, what's getting changed in this database. So mapped cryptographic primitives. So that, and you use blockchains to change control over mapped cryptographic primitives, right? is the solution to the database problem. And so in the instance where you're creating a new entry, right? So the new entry would be, this is me. So me as being authenticated and verified and identified by a certain credential, for example. And so now when we have my go-to example, unfortunately, remains to be digital driver's licenses. So now that I have a digital driver's license, a certificate, a credential that's being issued by a government agency, and I have this on my enclave, on my iPhone, I have it. No one else has it. This particular instance should invalidate every single copy. So that there should actually be kind of like Getty Images scans the web all the time, every single day for abuse of images that they claim copyright to. So in the same way, we should have these tools that signify, hey, you're the credential holder. This is like your first, last name in this particular combination. Someone else is using it. That should throw up a flag. And obviously, it's more complicated than that. And what we are still, from a technology perspective, a couple of years away from being able to do that. At the same point in time, we are introducing all these primitives right now. So it's important to understand that we need to reverse the paradigm shift in two ways. One, I control access to that, and I can stream access to that. And B, it will invalidate copies. It will invalidate every single copy that's out there because I'm here. Just like my earlier example of my phone not transmitting my location information. If I'm not using it, if I'm not making utility of that, then there's no need for anybody else to know that as far as I'm concerned. Then at that point in time, doing this should throw out an alert and, like, broadly speaking, should be classified as warrantless surveillance, regardless if it's being done by a regulatory or a government agency or by a private company, right? So by virtue of being private, as far as I'm concerned, you're not all of a sudden allowed to surveil me. Anyway, so long story short, I'll be spending the next 10, 20 years on identifying solutions that get this right and also identifying solutions that get this wrong. And Jeff has done an awesome job aggregating these type of data brokers that we think get it wrong and store a lot of what we call toxic data. And we'll also make it our objective to invalidate the business model of these entities.
Yeah.
And promote, yeah. Anyway, so again, yes, like try to
Sorry.
stop me.
Didn't mean to interrupt you. I was just going to say.
No. You should, because I can go on about these topics, as you know, forever. Like the topics that I talk about, I don't talk about because I have a product to promote, but because I'm passionate about finding actual solutions to that, investing into actual solutions to that, and bringing people together to work together to find solutions to these problems, right?
It's a great name. Your Bytes, Your Rights. Fridays at noon Pacific time. I heard a rumor you guys might be expanding into the audio world. So maybe we can tell people where they can find it in the near future. But for right now, it's easily accessible on YouTube. I don't know. Do you guys put it out anywhere else? That's where I've been tuning in.
Yeah, not yet. We will be a full-fledged podcast soon, probably in the next couple of weeks.
Awesome. Yeah, it's really been an honor to have you guys on. I'm privileged to know you, and really appreciate the work that you're doing. The conversation is extremely important. I feel like we're right there where there's still a chance to make a difference, but if we don't do something soon, then it's going to be that much more difficult to bring it back. So yeah, I don't know. I'll give you guys the floor for the rest of the show if you want to leave us with anything or ways to connect. Please feel free.
John, right now we only really have a LinkedIn group for this endeavor. We have a website, ybyr.news. It's mostly a news aggregator at the moment, which kind of surfaces the things that we want to talk about. But definitely, if you're listening to that and you have a passion on topics of privacy, cybersecurity, personal human agency. Really, and everybody, as far as I'm concerned, should be passionate about these topics because it's going to influence your future in a very, very significant way. We are at this precipice to where either we get it entirely wrong and all of us will live in awful surveillance states where every one of your digital and physical movements is monitored every second of the day and your behavior is influenced by a third party. And by the way, just the observation of your behavior is changing your behavior. That's an important thing to note. And unfortunately, most people are not in such a privileged position that Jeff and I and you, Ethan, are in, where we can have these discussions at all, right? That's also important to realize. More than half of the world lives under authoritarian regimes where like even voicing these thoughts would be considered by the government as dissenting with the government's opinion on what should be talked about, right? And so these people may face a lot of government intervention, including disappearance, incarceration, fining, and so forth. So, but unfortunately, because we are mostly ignorant about these externalities, we more or less tolerate them, right? So we just think that's the way the world is when it's really not, right? So it's really the fact that these tools should serve every human being, should serve every human being in the same way, and should make kind of, it sounds foo-foo, but make the world a better place. Like my objective ultimately is that we, what I call, recreate reality consensus within the next, hopefully, decade. It probably will take 2 decades, because in my mind, we broke reality, right? So it used to be, to make a very simple example, back in the old world, in the olden days, everybody would watch kind of the same news at the same point in time, synchronous, and then you would have discussions around the same world topics on a daily basis. Now everybody gets their own news. They get to live in their own reality. And because there is a third party interest that's influencing this reality, it's in that third party's interest to make this more outrageous and polarize it more, because that feeds our lizard brain. That gets us outraged and gets us more engaged, rather than what we should be doing is focus on what makes us the same. Because you and I and everybody that's listening to this is almost identical, right? So from a physiological perspective, from the wants and needs, right, we're pretty much identical. That's what we need to be focusing on. We all need to breathe clean air. We all want clean water for ourselves. We all want shelter. We want food and so forth. And we all want our loved ones to be safe and so forth. I don't think anybody would agree with any of these premises. Right? We typically, we all want to live a long and healthy life. So let's start from that premise that we're all the same and emphasize that. Create reality consensus again on the topics that we completely can agree upon. And then in the next step, identify what are the problems that make us feel like we are different and solve those. Right? So identify the things where people think, no, you're different, you deserve to be treated different. By default, no one deserves to be treated differently, right? No one deserves to be incarcerated. There's very few people in the world that are like born bad, presumably. At least that's my thesis, that deserve to spend all of their life in prison, or for that matter, all of their life under an authoritarian regime, being told what to do and say and eat and whatnot. I don't want this for anybody, right? I want everybody to be happy, healthy, because I think that as a primary outcome, that will make me more happy, because I'm personally affected by that. As in, I find it terrible to watch these news and hear about people that are being mistreated. And I think a lot of that can be attributed to the way we do information distribution, which is not fostering collaboration, which is not fostering cooperation, which is not fostering the insight that we're all the same and all need the same. And again, sorry for like if that sounds again like foo-foo and esoteric. For me, this is a practical concern, right? So that let's use these tools to the extent that they foster my own well-being and everybody else's well-being. To me, as I said, it's the same thing.
I agree. And you can have more conversations just like this with us on not only on the show, but on LinkedIn. We discuss this stuff almost daily on posts and on our feeds.
Yeah, and we need more people. We need more people to learn the language of that space, learn other people's languages. Like again, I mean, it's not about privacy. To most people is kind of an esoteric thing. Like that's kind of the box that they check before they engage with a service. It's really about self-determination and stuff, about your own freedom ultimately, right? The freedom to decide what you think and what you do. And if you don't realize you don't have this anymore, then yes, you're going to live in this kind of matrix world where you're being fed thoughts that you're thinking by some entity that doesn't have your best interest in mind.
Right. You really can't have freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, any of our real basic freedoms if you don't have privacy.
Yeah, it's freedom of thought. That's like precedes all of that. And freedom of thought also then includes that you expand your language, right? So you cannot have discerning thoughts if you don't have the language tools for that. And that's big part of the reason why we're having these discussions, to bridge these kind of silos of discussions. It's not a regulatory discussion. It's not a legal discussion. It's not just a engineering discussions. It's a discussion overall about human well-being, right? Using technologies. And to the extent that Jeff and I can influence that, we'll keep doing this, keep doing it for free. And we'll hope that people appreciate that by joining us, not by giving us likes, by joining us in that effort and distributing that particular message, right? Because there's not enough people like that, unfortunately. A lot of people like to be entertained. And it's not like that I don't like to be entertained, but I think long term, it's so much more stimulating if you're working towards real change in the world that you can leave should you ever move on, right? Which I'm not planning on doing.
Agreed.
Yeah. Okay.
All right.
It's been
Thank
a real
you,
pleasure.
Ethan. Yeah. Appreciate the opportunity to talk.